Welcome back to the garage. We're going to be installing our custom clocking ring to rotate that transfer case up and out of harm's way, and then building a transmission crossmember so our engine and transmission will be fully supported. Check it out.
Our new custom machine clocking ring. The original stud location will now accept a countersunk bolt, so it's mounted flush. And then we will insert a stud into this location, which will allow the transfer case to be clocked, giving us ground clearance. Big shout out to Smoke Wrench for getting this thing machined on a time crunch for us so we can continue on with the build.
I have installed the 12-degree clocking ring here and lowered everything into place, centered up our output flange in the tunnel, and we're pretty happy with the clearance. If you look from the side here, you can see it hangs a little below the frame. Actually, if you want to throw that up there. Basically, you know, a little bit below the frame. So we're going to be making control arm mounts that are going to be below the frame here anyway. So I'm going to kind of integrate a crossmember that drops it down to protect that. So the crossmember will be below the transfer case. So I'm going to get some measurements and start making some templates.
First of all, I'd like to thank Jonah for coming over and helping out building the crossmember. So what we're doing here is taking some measurements, getting an idea of the best way to put a crossmember in there that's not going to block the drive shaft, it's not going to hang down too low, and it's going to allow us to tie in the control arm mounts in the same location that the crossmember is mounted to the frame. We decided to use a piece of leftover frame rail at 2x4 square tubing, so we set to work cutting it and modifying it to fit. So we have cut a hole in the top of this square tube that allows this mount to be recessed into it. And then there's a plate, a 3/8 thick steel plate that has the holes drilled in it. And what we're gonna do here is put some tubing up and weld it in so that way we can still get a socket in there, but dirt and debris can't get wedged into there and rust it out. So we want to make sure that these bolts aren't hanging out the bottom, which is why we're recessed up in there. We didn't want it to hang all the way down, which is why, so we're like halfway in between. I'm gonna make some steel tubes that go in here, and then we're gonna weld that in place so then we can start building the outer parts. You can get an idea of what that plate looks like, and how that fits inside. So that fits inside that square tube tightly, so it can be welded on those long edges, right? So we'll be welding this to the inside of the square tube. And here's the cavity. We'll be cleaning that up a little bit before we weld. And then we're going to cap these so that any dirt that does, that comes on the top can't go inside the tube. This is a piece of the tubing we're going to be using, and it is a nice tight fit in these holes. So in order to ensure that everything's going to line up correctly, I'm going to make a piece that will center the tubing on this so I can weld it to this plate, and knowing that it's going to be in the correct location to slip into that cross member. So I want to make something on the lathe that indexes off this smaller hole while it has an OD that tube can slip over and locate it so it's not wobbling around and it's not going to end up in the wrong location. So I'm going to make that on the lathe now. I have the jigging set up to weld. You get this little guy that indexes nicely in there, and then the sleeve presses nice and tight over there. I'll weld those up. Now that I have those tubes welded onto the base plate, I flipped over the square tube and I'm welding the back side. And I'm going to flip it over and weld the tubes right onto that square tube. So those sleeves are now welded in place to the cross member. And again, it just provides some protection. The bolts aren't hanging out the bottom. We can still get a socket up in there, so it should be less likely to hang up on obstacles when we're sliding over things. This really isn't dropped down very much. Initially I was going to drop it down further, but after looking at drive shaft clearance in full droop, and the suspension's all the way down, the drive shaft could have contacted here, so I ended up not sinking it down as much as I had initially planned. I will be boxing in these little areas to the side, and then we'll be fully welding that. But for now, we're going to get this thing bolted up and start making some templates for the pieces that will be welded onto the frame. We have a crossmember. Engine and transmission are now fully held in place. Motor mount and transmission crossmember, all in place. I haven't fully welded the transmission crossmember yet, but it is able to support the weight of the transmission, which is cool. It's nice. Now I'm not having carts rolling around underneath it or having to hold it up with ratchet straps, all that sort of stuff. It's done. If you look at that transfer case with the clocking ring on it, we are above that crossmember, providing us some clearance, right? That's nice. I may build something that comes off of here, like a little bash guard, a little skid plate that drops down there, just to protect it when we get out in the rocks, so that may or may not happen. Now this area over here, the reason that it's kind of unfinished looking is because we're going to be making a mount for the lower control arm off of that same area. So we're going to tie into that, and then that will go to the bottom of the axle with a suspension link. So that's why we haven't finished this. I'm going to get it at ride height and then do all the measurements for the 3-link in the front so we can kind of get our geometry figured out. But for now, the transmission crossmember is in and it's functioning to hold everything in place so we can put it at that ride height. Before we were rolling around in this cart, so I couldn't pick the engine up and down. Now we can actually achieve that.
All right, transmission crossmember is in place. This is a huge step. Just being able to hold the transmission, the whole drivetrain is held up now. So I can go up and down and move the chassis in relation to the axle, so I can set all our suspension heights and start playing with that geometry. It's been a long time getting there. I mean, just building this front frame section, building the motor mounts, transmission crossmember, it's taken a while, but that's one of the most fundamental parts of this build. So now that that's in place, we can move on to doing some of the more exciting stuff, like designing the suspension, seeing what it's going to look like at ride height, and all those fun things. So don't forget to subscribe, check out the rest of the build.